Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Patricia and Phyllis Frost Art Museum. Thank you for being here today. FIU is a special place for learning, research, and community engagement. At the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum, we aim to be a part of both campus and community in vital and dynamic ways, exemplified by free admission, free programming, and bringing world-class exhibitions to campus like Relational Undercurrents, Contemporary Art of the Caribbean Archipelago, curated by Tatiana Flores. This exhibition was organized by the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach, and we are thrilled to have the president and CEO of MOLA, Lourdes Ramos Rivas, here today. It is my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest curator and moderator today, along with our distinguished panelists. Tatiana Flores is Associate Professor in the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies in the Department of Art History, and an affiliate of the Critical Caribbean Studies program at Rutgers University. A specialist in modern and contemporary Latin American art, she is the author of Mexico's Revolutionary Avant-Garde, From Estredentismo to 3030, published by Yale University Press in 2013. Her second book project, In Progress, focuses on the art and visual culture of Venezuela during the presidency of Hugo Chavez. Her exhibition, Relational Undercurrents, is a tour de force and has been on view at the Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia University and will next travel to Portland, Maine. We are thrilled to highlight one of our faculty members on today's panel. Andrea Queeley is Associate Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies at FIU. Dr. Queeley is also Associate Professor in the African and African Diaspora Studies program. Her book, Rescuing Our Roots, The African Anglo-Caribbean Diaspora in Contemporary Cuba, was published in 2015. Dr. Queeley's research interests include Caribbean migration, Cuba, African diaspora, race, social inequality, Black popular culture, and anthropological fieldwork. Specifically, her research concerns African diaspora, subject formation, migration, and the notion of globalized structural inequalities. Adler Guerrier lives and works in Miami, Florida, where he received a BFA at the New World School of the Arts. Guerrier recently had widely acclaimed solo exhibitions at the California Museum of African American Art and at the Perez Art Museum here in Miami. He has exhibited his work at the Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, the Bass Museum of Art, the Harn Museum, and in the Whitney Biennial in 2008. His works can be found in public collections, including the Museum of Contemporary Art North Miami and the Studio Museum in Harlem. Miami-based interdisciplinary artist Charo Oquet has a wide-ranging practice, including performance, sculpture, painting, video, and photography. She is known for her dynamic installations, which incorporate idioms of popular Afro-Caribbean religions. She has exhibited at the Pavilion of Contemporary Art in Italy, MoCA North Miami, Bass Museum, New Zealand National Gallery, and the Museum of Modern Art in the Dominican Republic. Oquet's work is found in permanent collections like our own Frost Art Museum, the Bass Museum, the New Zealand National Museum, among others. And I'm very also proud to share with you that Charo is a graduate of FIU. Thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it over to you, Tatiana.
Thank you so much. It's incredibly exciting to be here because the exhibition originated in Long Beach, California, the Museum of Latin American Art. And it was an exhibition that was funded by the Getty Foundation as part of a program called PST LA, so Pacific Standard Time LA. And presumably LA stood for Los Angeles, Latin America. But it also, and they wanted to keep the ambiguity because it was inclusive of Latinx groups in the United States. The initiative was a tour de force in itself. It launched in September 2017 after 5 years of preparation, and it encompassed over 70 exhibitions around Los Angeles and the surrounding cities, but it also 40 of those were funded by the Getty, and they also had a kind of broader umbrella initiative. So it was just wild to have the city of Los Angeles be completely devoted to Latin American art over a 4-month period last year. And so within that initiative, I had the opportunity to curate this exhibition. And it's a long story of how the exhibition came about. But basically, part of the way that I thought to create an exhibition on the Caribbean was to respond to the idea of Latin America as a fixed geography. And I think that a lot of that was sort of the premise of LA was that Latin America consists of the Spanish-speaking countries of the, south of the Mexican border and Brazil. And I wanted to think about Latin America in a just more exclusive and expansive way. So this exhibition, titled Relational Undercurrents, Contemporary Art of the Caribbean Archipelago, maps a view of Caribbean art based on artists who are descended originally and are engaging with island countries in the Caribbean. And that was really deliberate because the concept of Latin America that most people are familiar with sort of thinks about the big countries, from Mexico to Argentina. And so it's often a continental narrative that gets emphasized. And what I really wanted to do with the exhibition was not only, argue for the inclusion of the Caribbean and thinking about Latin America, but also think about the places that are just almost always overlooked, and especially small countries, Caribbean islands. There's also a lot of things to say about Central America and other places in Latin America, and then countries in South America that are considered part of a Caribbean map that I didn't have the opportunity to say with this show. But this show is really taking the islands as a point of departure and arguing and kind of pushing back against a monolithic view of Latin America. So not only kind of contesting the continental narrative and contesting the Hispanophone privileging of the region, but also thinking about how histories are constructed in ways that really elevate some and then totally ignore others. And so it turned out within this huge initiative of over 40 exhibitions that were Getty funded and 70 total, 70 plus, that it was only one of 2 exhibitions focusing on the African diaspora. And the other was an exhibition at the Fowler Museum, which is a museum in UCLA, the USCLA campus, and that one was on art of Northeast Brazil and of Bahia. And so that was something that was really, notable that, so Latin America and the concept of Latin America seemed to be really emphasizing different kinds of identities and not so much the Black experience in the Americas. And so that, and the exhibition is really kind of having a different sort of narrative around the Caribbean, not as exclusively an African diaspora, but just challenging some of the ideas and presuppositions. Another presupposition that is often made around the Caribbean is that it is a space of heterogeneity, that there are so many kind of specific nationalist histories that a regional narrative is almost impossible because everything, and there's even this has been theorized by people like Antonio Benitez Rojos, who talked about the Caribbean through the lens of chaos theory, and basically that the Caribbean is, akin to the workings of the chaos theory of mathematics. And so a lot of the narratives and the exhibitions that have come out, when they're not focused exclusively on art of Cuba or Jamaica or Haiti, for example, often that was the premise, heterogeneity, and so eclecticism. And I wanted to also tell a different story and look for the regional connecting threads. So those were sort of the premises that started off this just incredibly wonderful experience. I had originally, previously curated in the Caribbean especially with one of the artists who unfortunately is not on view, but who was part of the show in, when it was exhibited at MoLA in Long Beach. And that's Christopher Cozier, an artist from Trinidad. And he was really kind of my teacher of Caribbean art. But as academically a Latin Americanist, I focused on Mexico in my dissertation and book research, and I'm from Venezuela originally. So I had a sense of, there's something that's really fragmented about these histories, and I wanted to kind of put all of that together and bring forth a narrative that speaks about that inclusion and that really opens up our especially an understanding of Latin America that is coming out of the West Coast. And so there's very much that was also very much an interest, was to think about Latinx groups in the U.S. or other countries that are beyond kind of Mexico and the issue around the border that's so prevalent in California and the Southwest U.S. And think about other borders and think about other stories of people who have had experiences that have been marginalized in different ways, and how that kind of diversity can be narrated through an exhibition. And so, but within that, in incredible experience of telling this story, I encountered artists like Adler and Charo and a great many more from Miami who are here in the show. And as a person who's Venezuelan American, I'm also really sensitive to the ways in which knowledge about Venezuela or about Latin America is created, like wherever I'm not, so it's like, knowledge is in Venezuela or somewhere else and so I'm, as a person who inhabits a diaspora space, really sensitive to ways in which my form of knowledge and what I can bring to the table often get understated by privileging national histories. And I know that a lot of the artists, at least about half, and originally the artists, there were over 80 artists in the show, and it's reduced from that number, but about half are based elsewhere. And in fact, the Caribbean itself is almost an original diaspora, because just of the patterns of colonization and indigenous peoples and cultures not prevailing in the islands. And so one of the things that Derek Walcott, the poet, St. Lucian poet, said was that the Caribbean is made up of people who come from elsewhere, and so that idea of diaspora and knowledge production is also very much at the heart of this project. So with that said, I'm really so excited to be part of this panel, to be talking to a different audience here in Miami, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and learning from you as well. And especially when you see the show, please come and talk to me about what your takeaways are. It's such a privilege, and I'm really grateful. So what I would like to do is to ask my co-panelists to introduce themselves and their work, and we can start building our discussion from there. Thank you.
I guess I'm next. Let's see. So there's so much that you said that really resonates with me, and I kind of thought, oh, this is why I was invited on the panel. Because there's many different themes that I think, that I work with and I'm interested in and moved by that come up, in this exhibit. And I would just say that the first one has to do with movement and connection. And I got a chance to actually get a little sneak peek of the exhibit, and one of the central themes that I saw is movement. I mean, there's a lot of cartography and cartographic imagery and playing with that, and so the way that movement is related to displacement, is related to traumatic dispersal. Obviously, I work with diaspora, and so that's one of the things that I'm interested in, is the kind of point of connection, that connection that is underlying, I think, the genesis of this work, right, of this exhibit. What is the role of kind of trauma and traumatic memory and forced displacement in this connection, right, in the connection that binds, right? So if it's, if it's not language, right, we can talk about all of the disjunctures and all the differences, the distinctions, and the ways that those distinctions have been emphasized, right? But if we turn away from that, what are we turning towards, right? So, and I grapple with this a lot in my classes and, obviously with my work on inter-Caribbean migration. So looking at the dispersal of people from the English-speaking Caribbean primarily to the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, and the definition, of course, of Caribbean is up for debate, right? So we're talking about geographic space, we're talking about kind of historical connection, histories of colonization and enslavement, economic connections, climate. I mean, there are all these different ways that we can talk about what shapes the region. I mean, is Miami a site of the Caribbean? Is New Orleans a site of the Caribbean, right? So when we, in my work and thinking about kind of what shapes who people become as a result of displacement, right? How is it that particular structures, power relationships, and histories have emerged to not necessarily determine, but to influence, impact the way in which people see themselves, and then I think the way in which people also articulate themselves and their vision of their environment and their world through their artistic production, right? And so a question that I have that I'm hoping that will engage in the Q&A has to do with the connection, right? So what is it? What are the kind of ties that bind? And what are the stakes in emphasizing connection versus disjuncture, right? That's one of the questions I also look at in my work is, well, why is it that people kind of choose or move to see themselves as a part of, as belonging to a particular entity, whether or not that's Caribbean, national, excuse me, racial, like what is it that influences that, and how does that change over time and space, right? So I'm hoping that we'll grapple with some of those questions and look at the stakes of connecting, and what the bases of those connections might be, and then what are the kind of stakes with emphasizing disjuncture, indifference, and disconnection, right? And what is that privilege? So I'll just end it there. And
well, I was already introduced, so I won't do that. I have 3 works in the show, a wall painting and 2 works in the series that I refer to as the folds. One is unfolded and one is still within a compact form. The series of work, they kind of, all 3 work as an installation. In essence, is kind of a proposal on a kind of a domesticated space, the space that we live in. One of the questions that you asked that I wrote down is what shapes what people becomes. So I guess there's a lot there for me, and the 2 things is that I really enjoy, and the question is this notion of shape and form and the sort of conditions of shaping. It's not random, and even within the long historical arc of any individual or country or geographical island that emerged of the ocean that people live in, those arcs, there's a lot in it. Or even a simple fact of moving from Haiti to Miami and spending most of your life in Miami. So this shaping and what's in it, it's almost it's a black box in a way. We don't know what's in the box, but we do know what comes out of it. So in terms of your question, it's subjectivity in a way. That's what comes out of it. It's fully formed humans, hopefully, that's not too scarred by the process of going through that box. So for me, my work upstairs is a kind of a proposal of where that occurs, where do subjects, where do people live, how do they shape their environment as much as they can, not necessarily to the physical, but sometimes it's through the trick of language, through the trick of colors, and sometimes bold enough through architecture. But that's that's what's in the work, and that's it for now.
Well, I was born in the Dominican Republic. When I was 10, I was brought to the U.S. My parents had to exiled. And then at 16, I went back to the Dominican Republic. But most of my education from age 4, which I don't know if before that I was really educated very well because I was moving a lot, was in the United States, and then I went back to American schools. So my knowledge of Dominican history, apart from what I got from living there and stuff, was very minimal, really. And so the work that you'll see here is it's a documentation of a performance I did in 2006, which was where I tied myself to a Haitian vendor. And we were back to back, and we were trying to do things together. And it was very much a comment on how Dominican Republic and Haiti sort of relate to each other, which very much...
Amber alert.
Is it an Amber Alert? Oh, it's not a fire drill? Oh.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, no.
So Dominican, yes. So the fact that, Dominican Republic and Haiti is very much back to back. Like they don't, the Dominicans don't know very little about Haitians really, and the Haitians as well. And I felt that, we had a situation where we share the country, we share an island, and that we must work together, and that the idea of us not knowing and not trying to work together is crazy, as it is to try to work like I had been with the gentlemen tied to each other in our backs. I have been a painter, sculptor, installation artist, and many other things, but performance is one of the mediums that I tend to, that I have actually for the last 7 years been mostly part of my practice. But I want to speak a little bit about, that my work is so much about decolonizing. It is something that, because I have been a migrant in both the U.S., New Zealand, where I lived for 4 years, England, I've lived in Spain. I've been a migrant in many places, and sometimes in a way in my own country, because when I went back there, and I've been back there, it's like sometimes you're not really fitting in. And so the idea of, who are we and what am I? Because I'm also biracial. My mother is a black Dominican. My father was a white Dominican. And, there was a lot of, from my mother's part, she spoke a lot about race, especially, but at the same time, she had this kind of double standard, and I couldn't really understand her because she would be there was a lot of self-hatred in a sense, and that's something that you see a lot in the Dominicans, where there is a lot of denial about their blackness and a lot about, where, we speak badly about ourselves in a sense, about our hair, about our mouths, all kinds of stuff. And being in New Zealand in the early 80s, where they were going through a decolonizing process between the Maoris and the white colonials, I basically started to also think about, how we saw ourselves and start to, beginning with my family, then to actually learn more about what was actually African culture, what was Dominican, or what was Spanish, because we're very syncretic, and a lot of it is not really very clear, especially because in the Dominican Republic, especially at that time, there hadn't been that much information out there about, the culture and the differences between the two, the African and the Spanish. It was all very kind of connected and not very clear. So I have set out since then to try to understand not only about the way we see ourselves, but our relationship to Haiti and, their history and their culture and our history and our culture. So all of that is reflected in my work. So.
Wow. Yes, it's so interesting, this question of identity. And we had a discussion in New York when, as the show, it was a kind of closing ceremony with a day-long symposium. And somebody in the audience made a comment, and you'll see the exhibition soon enough, but the point was made that it's so refreshing to see artwork that's just not exclusively about identity and that is apolitical. And it was funny because that's not my takeaway from the work, so it's interesting what people bring and the perspective that they bring. But for instance, Adler's work is a part of the exhibition, so there are 4 themes in the exhibition. Conceptual mappings, which deals with work that maps its own cartographies, personal, and sort of rethinks the map in ways that move beyond the kind of colonialist map that we're all familiar with. So that in Adler's piece is part of that section. There's a section called Perpetual Horizons, and it's about the horizon line as a distinguishing feature of island geography, and how that plays in either thinking about the horizon is very poetic and metaphorical, but sometimes as a kind of limitless sort of projection, or else as a boundary that entraps and closes off. And so there are works that speak to those and other concerns. A section on landscape ecologies that speaks about shared habitats and environmental threat, but also taking a view of the Caribbean that's very contrary to the view that the tourism industry promotes of the islands as interchangeable, of a kind of island life as a blank slate. And so the artists in that section are very much calling attention to other ways of thinking of place and representational acts, and that's where Charo's piece is located. And representational acts thinks about representation as an active process. Representation is so much embedded in the discourse of Western art history as the narrative of the Renaissance and learning how to plot the world onto 2 dimensions and mimesis. And so representation in the way that the exhibition thinks of it as an active process and not a passive rendition, but rather not only representation, sort of rethinking those tropes, but also as a kind of assertion of self. And so I often think that sometimes the exhibition could even just be the 2 either representational acts or conceptual mappings, and there's some works that really kind of blur the boundaries between the thematic categories. But in a sense, it's that it's sort of trying to locate a taxonomy for thinking about works that are often made with no relation to the other artists, with no awareness of what people are doing there at other islands or other communities, diasporic communities, but that somehow still resonate through their interconnection. And so getting back to that point of like, this is so refreshing to have a show that's not about identity, one of the artists, Magdalena Campos Pons, whose work is upstairs, took issue with that, and later when it was her, she spoke on a panel, and she said, you know what, like, sir, like Michelangelo's, like David has identity embedded in it, like everything, when, even if it's a sort of white male European, like there is identity embedded. It's just that that's an invisible identity that becomes our universal. And so, that thinking about identity shouldn't have to be like, it's something to move beyond, but rather something that really just colors like everything that we experience, whether we're aware of it or not. And my own identity is as a Venezuelan person who moved to this country when I was 6 years old, and which was a painful, and as I don't know if there are other Venezuelans in the audience, but I think we're all dealing with the pain of loss of our country. But at that moment for me, this is, in the 80s, this isn't when, this crisis exploded, but the nostalgia and the sense of loss as a 6-year-old that I felt for having lost like my family, my community. And then when we were able to go back over the summers, the sea as something that felt like like incredibly, that was one of the markers of my own sense of place, was the Caribbean Sea. And so as I kind of moved through life and started sort of learning about, literature and art and the things I studied, that sort of question of like, why is Trinidad right next to us and I don't really know anything about Trinidad, and why is Guyana like on Venezuelan maps? Like it's called in Spanish zona en reclamación, reclamation, zone under reclamation. And like Guyana looks like a series of bars, like on maps of Venezuela. And so that way of like not knowing like your next door neighbors was really baffling to me, because in a way, like, I thought that we were all connected. And so it wasn't until I became more adult and, going through the university that I was made aware of barriers instead of the connections that I assumed amongst sort of the people who inhabited the similar regions. So I'm really grateful to the artist for bringing that up.
I'm not sure how to speak, but my work, even though, like I said, I thought when I started to really work on decolonizing, a lot of people weren't really talking about that, because I'm talking about the early 80s, and I was in New Zealand. I was the only Dominican there, and one of very few people of African heritage. Although, like, New Zealand calls themselves, blacks, the Maoris, but the Maoris are very different from the Africans, so I think it was the absolute need of not having any African blood or culture around that really made that part of me really rise and want to know more about it. And moving to the U.S., especially Miami, has been amazing because there's so much of it here. I mean, we are so lucky that we have so much of the African diaspora here and the African culture here, beginning with, the Haitians, there's Brazilians, there's Cuban, Dominicans, everyone is here in a sense. And for me, it has been amazing to be able to learn a lot about, the culture and the religions, which I have studied to a certain degree. I'm not going to say I'm an authority on it, but it's helped me to clarify so many things. So I think Miami is an amazing place for this particular show to be in, because we are very, very fortunate. Although I don't think Miami sees itself so much like that yet. I think we have a lot more to really appreciate all this great richness that we have here, and actually, accept it as our own, like New Orleans does, for example. Speaking about identity, I think that, that has always been something that I wanted to know. I wanted to know who I was. When I first came here, I was thought of as Hispanic. And when I went to New Zealand, they looked at me as African American. And it was my first time to see myself as a black person. Because, in Dominican Republic, you have all shades of like black. You're like lights. In fact, the word black did not exist in the Dominican passport until I think in the 90s. We were considered to be, dark Indian, light Indian. We never, the only person that was black was the Haitian. So the Dominican, even if you could be as black as whatever, you were never black. You were brown. You were another color. So the identity, taking on the identity of, African identity and assuming it, has helped me so much to really be able to sort of understand and also study it and to see myself as part of a greater group. It's like,
I don't know. Question. She asked me a question. I can answer that. No?
I did want to mention, and I've come to Miami many times over my first vacation in the United States was to Miami. I have family here. I feel really connected here, and I really, really like it here. But I'm also curious about some of the ways that people of Latin America are thought of in different spaces in the United States. So one of my big arguments, and in California, there's a big divide between Latin American and Latinx, and that Latinx implies U.S. Latino diaspora, and Latin American implies people that are living, outside of the United States, except that it also becomes a way of creating other different forms of identity politics. And so the Latinx and how that's seen in Miami is something I'm still not completely clear on, and curious to find out about, having more conversations while the show is here. And especially, so one of my big arguments around the show is that Latin America is an idea. It's not actually a place. And that right now, I think that the borders of Latin America have changed, and to me the U.S. is part of Latin America, and of course Miami is, and New York is, and different spaces especially, but I think that Latin America becomes where the diaspora is in itself. And so I see that as a very kind of porous border. And for me, the word Latinx and Latin American aren't mutually exclusive, because I think of borders in that kind of porous way. And I don't know how, whether people share this opinion or not, and where I know that in California they don't, and in New York not so much, but I'm curious about how Miami thinks of that, and maybe that's something that my fellow panelists can give me a better sense of. And of course, then people from Haiti and identifying as Latin American, and definitely people from from the Anglophone islands and other Francophone islands, and how you feel about whether you want to be included in that rubric or not. I mean, certainly in the context of the Getty Foundation's initiative, it was, either you were, Latin American somehow and included in these exhibitions, or your story didn't get told. So for me, it was really, it was a kind of strategic point to make this happen. I should mention, because I did already talk about another exhibition on the African diaspora, that there was another exhibition on the Caribbean as part of that series, which was of the Asians in the Caribbean. And that exhibition included Trinidad and Jamaica unproblematically as part of Latin America, and I love that about it. And it was a great show. And Nicola Y, who is here and is also, she's in one of the artists in the show. She was also in that exhibition as well. And so it was great to be able to have the possibilities opening up within that idea of what Latin America is. So I think that that's a question that I would for sure like to pose to my panelists.
Ooh, there's a lot to say about Miami. Wow. I guess I can preface my perspective on Miami, or my observations of Miami, by giving you a little background about where I come from. So I'm actually from California, from Northern California. I was born in Berkeley and went to schools in Oakland, and am more familiar with the kind of Chicano, growing up there was a kind of sense of Mexico. And then someplace, further south of Mexico, but really Mexico was centered, and that changed over time. My understanding of the debate was really about those people who identified as being, Mexican American or Chicano, which had a more kind of radical resonance, and then those people who were Mexican from Mexico, so actually I started studying Spanish when I was in when I was 11, and I was in the 6th grade. I switched from French to Spanish because there were a lot of Chicanos in my orbit, in my world, and there were also lots of murals. So there was a part of that aesthetic that I feel like I was exposed to from a young age. And then on my father's side, my grandparents migrated from Montserrat. So I have, and I would go to visit my grandmother on the East Coast, because my father was raised in Boston, and then my mother was Black American from Ohio, but then my grandparents are from other places. So the question of displacement, both are internal to the United States in terms of through the Great Migration of African Americans, throughout the country, and then from the Caribbean to the U.S. is definitely a part of my personal story, right? And then growing up around people and having friends whose parents were from elsewhere, right? My parents were from elsewhere. That was a consistent theme. So the question of how do people identify based on where we are now, versus where it is that we have come from where our families have come from, I think is a very exciting one. And then also bringing it to Miami, one that I see playing out in very interesting ways here. So I've lived here for 9 years. I moved here from New Orleans, actually. And I was in New York before then, so I've, lived in a few different places to see how this plays itself out. And I would say that I don't, the idea of Miami being this kind of Latin American space, and where there's this kind of dynamic interaction, is not something that I have experienced, right? That I experience it as a very segregated, very racially segregated place, with tremendous inequalities, and that there's we can see this within hiring practices. We can see this in many different spheres, right? And the rhetoric or the image of Miami as being this the furthermost northernmost Latin American city and this kind of multicultural mecca, I don't think really it is accurate in particular moments, perhaps. And it also, but is, I think, deployed in a way that obscures the kinds of inequalities that are really embedded within the Americas, right? That we have not figured out a way to move past. And so maybe there is a potential of that happening in Miami, but I don't see that happening actually now. I see tremendous amount of segregation and inequality, and it's racialized. It's a very racialized space. I could go on and on about different experiences, but that's how I see this place.
On this notion of what Miami is it's kind of interesting. I myself, born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, came to live in Miami when I was 12, and I first came to Miami for a summer when I was 10, and it's from my mind as a 10-year-old. The trip was a summer vacation. It was joy. It was to see the sort of big America that I've heard about and seen through TV, etc. Is to see it in reality, and so that was exciting more than it was traumatic. It wasn't traumatic at all. But what's interesting in Miami in 1986 is that it's not actually the sort of glitzy Miami that we know now. So to walk around Biscayne Boulevard in the, around 75th, 77th Street was actually quite rough in 1986, whereas now it's rebranded as an extension of Morningside, and there's other stuff that can be done there. So in essence, as far as my work is concerned, it's this sort of, it's these terms that are more fascinating for me. Because in a way, I really don't believe there's the utopia of equality and justice is probably not coming. But on the other hand, as a goal and as an idea and notion, some places are going to be, I guess, better than others. And this sort of better, and I'll use the word condition, this sort of the conditions to understand why it's better is going to be on multiple metrics. I don't think it's always going to be on the terms of capitalism. So things like property value, what people get paid, free access to healthcare. I mean, we know what utopia should be, but capitalism is not going to give us that. We can say that for a fact. On the other hand, what we do have, or what we can extract from a system, and this is the other thing that has not been said, it's like Miami is still in America, it's still an American city. It holds all American values, all of American history. And in a way, it is very different than Port-au-Prince, Haiti, because Port-au-Prince, Haiti has some American value and some Americanness that has come to shape it. But America has 100% of it. So that is the inequality. That is redlining. That is, eradicating ecologies. There's a lot, but it's not so much about defining the difference for me. That's actually interesting. Is once you are here, what are the operators? What are the things that you can put your hand on to make it yours? To create the space for, for you to become this this subject. Can you still become a subject in an unequal place, in an unjust place? In fact, you have to. That's the only way you can fight for greater justice. So that's what Miami holds, I think, because it is complex. My experience of Miami is actually quite fluid, and the fact that where my parents live, that neighborhood is diverse. My neighbor to the west is Haitian. After that is Puerto Rican, and further down the street is Jamaican. Across the street is American, and diagonal from them is Bahamian. It's nothing special. This unincorporated Dade County. It's not the sort of neighborhood with the sort of flavor of Little Haiti or Little Havana that is championed as a kind of a marker. I think those neighborhoods are not good example of what Miami is. I'm going to say 118th Street is a better example. And the reason is it's because what makes it formative in my mind, and to do something cheeky, is the relational undercurrent on 118th Street. It's not obvious what's on 118th Street. Walking up now on 118th Street, what you get to see is from the semi-public space of yards, yard decoration, the color of the houses, someone will happen to be walking at their house, their cars, signs, the bumper stickers in their cars. That's the language that I'm using to read 118th Street. And within that language, I say it's very fluid. And though I've only lived in Miami in the United States, so I can say anything I want about the rest of the country. I'm going to say Miami is richer. 118th Street is richer in a way that is real. Well, real is not a good word. That is everyday and true, and also critical. There's a critique of 118th Street that is offered to Miami at large, right? It's like, and that's what those are kind of things that I try to put on a palette and try to make work out of. So if, for example, an everyday photograph of that street, we begin with that as an image or model for Miami. How do we build that in order to reflect both a sense of the equality, but also tropical hopefulness, if there's such a thing? And that's the sort of range I think constantly is necessary. And that's probably why there's people here, and there's probably a lot less people, in Homestead, for example, which was a different narrative.
Can I just respond to that? Because that really, I'm so glad you brought up that image of 118th Street, because just to elaborate on what I was saying before, is that it is present, and it is in these kind of small signs that you're talking about, but because of the way the city is structured, because it's a car-dependent city, and the way that the neighborhoods are structured and the way it's spread out, there isn't a sense of a public space like a New York or New Orleans, right? And a public space for celebration, a public space for coming together, that maybe it's happening in these more isolated or siloed ways, but it doesn't, to me, it doesn't encompass the city. So it's kind of interesting dynamic.
That is a fair description, and to that I would say that is the critique 118th Street has to give. That's one of the critiques it has to give to the larger city. It's like, where can we stand and see five, or at least aspect of the complexity of the city, right? It's like, if being on Biscayne Boulevard or somewhere in downtown may not be the proper place for that because it's commercial and urban and serve businesses and simultaneously serve the presence of those who are not here because we know there are businesses here, et cetera. But that aspect is also reflect how life is lived in a way. There's a limit to our gaze. There's a limit to a sense of our perception. And what happens if we try to focus on that limit and demand more of it, right? Because I can tell you, 118th Street is not a real paradise because it doesn't have a park. It doesn't have a public place other than the street itself. But what it has, on the other hand, is it good enough? Is one of the sub questions I tend to link to it.
Well, I've been in Miami for 28 years, and I live in South Beach, which is a place where there are places where, like, the beach is one of the places that's like our park. We meet people in our parks as well. We have some parks that you get to meet a lot of people of all different races and stuff. I see Miami as such a fluid place, like Antonio Benitez says, Rojo, that, we are very much a place in formation. In my 28 years, I have seen waves of migrations come to Miami. When I first arrived, it was mostly Cubans. Then you had, Dominicans, you had Haitians, big Haitian. They were already Haitians here and Nicaraguans, but Hondurans, for example, have come in huge groups, Argentinians, Uruguayans. And each time these groups come in mass, because there's a lot of them coming at once, they change the city. And they change it in many different ways. For example, I can give a solid idea. For example, there's bakeries now in every bodega that weren't before. You have this little, you could buy little croissants and French. And that's your Uruguayans. And you could find wine shops everywhere. And, now in little bodegas, that's the Argentinians, for example. And that's just some solid things. But I feel that Miami has also, when it comes to the Latinx and the Latino, has, the people who've been here for a long time, who are maybe first generation, but have, like myself, been in the States for many years. And, someone like me, I see myself as both, for me, I'm both a Latinx and I'm also very much a Dominican because I go back and forth. Many people maybe don't have that experience. Maybe they come and they don't go back. I go back and forth a lot. So my work reflects a lot of that relationship to where I came from, even though I have actually more than one passport. But, I still feel very connected to my country, to what I consider my country, my roots, which is the Dominican Republic. But I feel also very connected to the Americas. I think you get a lot of that, where you get, and here you have constantly, people who've just arrived or who've been here 9 or 10 years or 2 years or whatever. And I think that they themselves are still very connected to their own country and how they see themselves. So I think Miami is a place where those, the Latinx and the Latin is still very not defined. I don't think that word has really hit us here very strongly as far as identity, because it is very fluid. It's still very, very fluid. I think that one of the things that, when we were talking about, the Latino, the Spanish speaking, that connects a lot of the Caribbean, but I think it's the African American, the African that also connects us, because in all of the Caribbean, there is the African element. And I think that we as people, like, I can connect with the Haitians, I can connect with any of the English speaking or French speaking Caribbean through my African. Where it's very, I can like when I remember hearing for the first time Rara in Little Haiti, I jumped. It was like I was home. In fact, that's been probably the closest thing to me, that reminded me of home in Miami, was to hear a Rara band marching in Little Haiti, And I think that probably the indigenous people, there's a lot of indigenous, people from the Americas that probably also connect themselves through the indigenous rather than the Spanish speaking. Maybe some of them don't even speak Spanish. They could come from Nicaragua and they don't speak Spanish, but they probably connect to maybe the Seminola, that. So there's, I think, different narratives and different kind of things that bind people here and identify people. So I think Miami is not a perfect place, as far as like, the class and race and all of that, those divisions that are very much here. But I think it's a place of hope in the sense that because I think that the hierarchies in Miami are very different than they are, for example, in New York or other places where, because Miami is a place like banking, hospitals of Latin America, a lot of people from all of these countries come to do business in Miami. So Miami sees those immigrants, they don't always think of them as like, necessarily the underclass, but identify them as someone they actually want here and they want to actually connect to. So I think that gives Miami a different kind of platform, a different kind of like setting that I've, as a Miamian now, feel that I have, that I've touched on, that you don't see in other, because I lived in New York, I've lived in New Jersey, and I don't think it was the same way. I don't think it was viewed in the same way.
You don't think that Latino or Latin American identity was viewed in the same way, or
I think that the way that the people here treat the Latin American, the migrant, or the person that comes here, or I think it's a very different space. Mm-hmm. I think that in both the North, where I've lived, it's much more marginalized. It's much more kept to a certain area. Definitely not. They're in the peripheries. Definitely not in the center. Mm-hmm. And I think in Miami, that space, the center space, is shared a bit more with the people from the Caribbean and in Latin America. That's my opinion.
I definitely see that. And I also, one question that begs for me is then in centering, in the process of centering, then who is pushed to the margins, right? That's one kind of comment or question that I want to throw out there. And then the other point, it's interesting because I actually lived in North Beach for 7 of the 9 years that I've lived here. Now I live in a gentrified area you were talking about. It's a very exciting place for me, being in a place where there are, Costa Ricans and Venezuelans and Cubans, of course, and, Dominicans and Brazilians. And so there's vibrant in that way. And also, Miami is the Deep South. By the way, like we're in Florida. I mean, it's different, but this history. If we know anything about the history of Miami, learn anything about the history of Miami, this is a Deep South, and with it. And when I say that, I mean, there's a lot of blood on this soil here, one of the questions that comes from my experiences with this, people from Latin America and different places in Latin America, has to do with the racial hierarchy, right? And how is it that ideas about race and systems of racial classification get kind of transplanted and transmitted and interact with those that exist that are rooted within U.S. Southern culture, right? And one of the things that is in common that I have found in common is the kind of sense of negrophobia or an anti-blackness that is very prevalent amongst Latin Americans. And so in this kind of tension or conflict between, at the same time, acknowledging this African ancestry and presence, in a particular way, but then also being kind of denigrating of blackness aesthetically, culturally in different ways. So I'm curious, and hopefully this will come out in the conversations in the Q&A, how you all see those as coming together, and specifically in Miami. And what are the ways in which that represents, the ways that they come together might be opportunities or potentials or, reasons to feel hopeful and perhaps reasons to feel a bit discouraged.
I don't want to interrupt because this is such a great conversation, but I am cognizant of time, and I do want to open it up to our audience. We have time for 2 questions, and I know. But we have a party, too, that's waiting for you. So I'm going to bring the mic to you. Are you first question here? Okay.
Thank you for this panel, and thank you for the opportunity of great art. And, You know, I feel I've been here since 1968, since I was 2 years old. I am Cuban, and living in Miami is a trajectory that is just incredible. Nowadays, I say that Miami is in a very dangerous field because, you know, the globalists know our weaknesses. The globalists like Dragon Global that has taken over Little Haiti, which is no longer Little Haiti, but it's called Magic City, they have taken over and they know exactly what is the weakness of Miami, which entails segregation, separation, and division because of that spirit of Jim Crow that, you know, fondles around here in the deep South, the dirty, dirty South. So, you know, I go to the black neighborhoods. I go to Little Havana. Everything is being gentrified, but we're not together. And, you know, the biggest thing that we can ever have in moving us together is the arts. But there's so many artists and so many people that are in the system with Magic City, with Dragon Global, with the other organizations that are really taking over the city and destroying it, because that's the way I'm seeing it, that are in the system that can help, but they're sellouts. And that's the grand issue that we have in Miami. And I hope that that we can do something about that, especially, you know, the people that are in the system. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anyone else? We have time for a few questions. We're gonna extend it to 4 here. So, and then I hope you'll all mingle with our panelists. Right, the opening is just beginning.
It's not so much I have a question, but I think I really want to bring up the point that I think something that's very productive with this exhibition is actually what it's bringing out for me. And I have lived in Miami back in 91, 92. I lived in Tampa, Florida for 9 years. I've lived in New York for 20-something years. I'm older than you think. I came here when I was 22 or 21 or whatever it is. Really, I think it's so important for us as Caribbean and Latin and Latinx people to not give in to this idea that's forced upon us that we are a monolith. We affect every space that we go into in a different way. We evolve in different ways. And this has been an amazing year for me with the Getty shows, you know, so a couple of them, and doing residency in New Orleans, and actually teaching in Austin now and living in New York still, and seeing how our people are different in all of those spaces and have affected those spaces in different ways, and that we are not some monolith is something I think is a major point of this show. And it's something that we have to maybe have a discussion with each other about, because I think we've sort of given in to this idea that we have this expectation that all our experiences will be the same. Miami did evolve. I mean, I had a Cuban lady in Little Havana cuss me out in 1991 when I walked into her store because she thought I was ashamed of my culture and I would not speak to her in Spanish. And her son had to run across and, I'm so sorry, my mom, she thinks you're Cuban, because you're Chino Latina. Well, I'm Afro-Asian, yes, but no, if I could speak to her in Spanish, I would, and I've seen this space evolve. I can't speak to it right now in this moment, but as I'm saying, we have really affected all of these spaces in the last 25 plus years, and I think we should examine that ourselves and be open to that.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, I just see one person back here.
Hi, Tatiana, good to see you. Erica. I have a question about curation and the way in which this exhibition was put together, but also how it moved. And you mentioned that some artists were included and not included. We know that we have done these sort of really large exhibitions of Caribbean work in the United States before, but this is one of the few exhibitions that has been able to move. throughout the country, from LA to New York and now to Miami. Could you speak a little bit about that movement and having to make choices about who gets to stay and who has to be taken out of the show, and how that impacts the narrative of the show maybe, or the way that the curatorial message is being delivered in each space, and how you responded to the space?
Yes, thank you for the question. The exhibition was designed for the Museum of Latin American Art, and it was important in that context, in that museum with that name, to include the Caribbean. And one of the things that was a huge privilege was to that the museum gave the entirety of its space to this exhibition. So it was many galleries, and we knew that when it traveled, and part of the way that it came together into a traveling exhibition was through Portland, Maine, actually. So where the curator had contacted the Getty and asked about PST shows that they could take, and so it was a maritime space that was so very different from any of the cultures represented here, and so that's where it's going to be going next. But Portland really began that conversation, and as we were. And I was kind of coming up with a very ambitious checklist. One of the ways that the exhibition sort of funded itself was through the traveling component. And so even, early on, we already had the 5 venues in place from sometime probably in 2016. And so luckily it was able to travel as projected. It changes a little bit with every city. In New York, for example, it was spread out over 2 venues. One of them was the Wallach Art Gallery, and another one was a children's museum in Harlem. And at the Children's Museum, everything had to be hung at eye level for kids, and so that was really intimate and special, and the work looked really different. At MOLA, I worked, and I think one of the artists in the show designed the exhibition. His name is Samir Bernardes, and he should be here later today, but he worked with me on the plans, and every single work that I chose was looked at in terms of the other work that would have been in the gallery, in terms of the model, and it was really, really carefully laid out for the MOLA space. And of course, I didn't have so much control over the checklist that traveled. Different things happened along the way. There's a big piece that's not on view here. That's by Tony Capellan, and a Dominican artist who very tragically passed away last December during the exhibition. And that piece was shown at PAM recently, and it's too large of a piece to bring out. We didn't have the space here, but it will go to the other museums. And so there's a trade-off in each of the different venues. Certainly, I see the MOLA space as the one that's the truest to my vision, but I'm so excited about being in this room and about having your feedback and talking to different people about what your takeaways of the exhibition are. And so just grateful to the Frost, but also just happy that it was able to go to New York. Even if it wasn't the same show, it's certainly changing and moving in the different spaces it inhabits. Thank you.
Do we have one last question? I see some of my students. Oh, okay, yes. I'm calling my student next time.
Yes, I would like to know from the panel how the African region spread here from the Caribbean is influencing the art, not only the art, but it's leveling sometimes the social classes. It crosses all the barriers, no? But how it is influencing in the art, something unique from Miami.
I want to just say a quick thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and that's the space of the African diaspora within the concept of Latin America. And I think that that's something that needs to be fleshed out further, and just more kind of emphasis in our discussions on Latin America and what it means. When I critique the idea of Latinx, because I think it implies a monolithic concept of Latin America. And for me, Latin America has porous borders and its frontiers change. But I do think that one of the things that happened in the Getty program that wasn't intentional, but that ended up being just unfortunately happening to come about, was that it was emphasizing a white Euro-descendant identity for Latin America in a way that was a bit counterproductive to a broader message of inclusion and diversity, so that Latin America was a white space, Latinx is a brown people, and then the Caribbean is black, and then the question of the Caribbean, whether it even belongs to Latin America. So even that question of the black experience in Latin America is still a work in progress. And very excitingly, there's new work in Brazil. Brazil has a huge black population, but its culture has been just overwhelmingly just a kind of Eurocentric narrative, and that's starting to change. But then when that permeates the bigger discourse on like the Latin American art as it's experienced in places like the MoMA and the Tate in the UK and London and Sotheby's and Christie's, that's still something that hasn't kind of come about quite yet. So I think that one of the points that I'd like to make to your question is that this blackness in Latin America is still a very a topic of conversation that needs to be become more mainstream in discussions of Latin Americans' own identity and history.
Yes, and I think that one of the things about the word Latinx is that, as you says, includes not only people of color, but of gender. Like, you know, it includes the queer, which is something that in a lot of Latin American countries is still a very difficult issue. So I think that space of Latinx is something that is growing, and hopefully, you know, will just not only be here in the U.S., but becomes a word that is so inclusive of all of us. So I think it's a very hopeful word. It's, you know, I mean, I tend to like to, you know, especially at moments like this, think about, you know, radical hope, and to look at the positive, because we know the negative. There's a lot of it. And when there's no denial that, you know, the issues of race, especially in the South, where we are, in Miami, is, you know, it has affected all of us and anyone who is of color here. But one of the things that we don't talk about a lot is class. And I think class, especially, I think that's something that happens a lot in Latin America, which is very class, you know, conscious, more openly class conscious than America, because America is as well, but doesn't talk about it. But Latin America is very much, and so, you know, as people migrate, that whole idea of class, which goes beyond color, by the way, you know, in a sense, you know, but of course, most of the people that are underclass are usually of color, and, you know, whether it's African or it could be indigenous. But when you come to Miami, you know, that comes here. And perhaps when I was saying about the hierarchies, that's a great part of it. You know, the class issue plays on the fact that there's a lot of, you know, people know that there's a lot of wealthy Latin Americans that come here, and which also, you know, talks about class, you know. So I think that's one of the issues that's a great part of it, about the way the people are, you know, repressed or kept under or whatever. And, you know, it's not just color. So.
Thank you. And thank you to all of the panelists.